Hi guys, welcome back in a new tutorial. Today we're gonna talk about shading with Vray, and we'll use a Megascan asset for the demonstration. So let's dive in. So I prepared a scene with some dome lights, and we're gonna make sure that the Megascan plugins is enabled. So render doesn't matter. Ideally we'd like Vray, but there's no Vray option. So let's grab this one or whatever. I think this should be a good one for the demonstration, and it's importing the geometry with the materials. So we're gonna need to convert this material into a Vray shader. So first thing I'm gonna do is copy that outside the mossy rock context. I don't really like having a subnetwork just for that, so I'm applying now some object properties for Vray. We also bring some displacement properties just to make sure that we can displace or mesh properly. Now it's time to create the material, so we're gonna first copy the path of these textures, and let's create a redshift material builder. We'll dive inside and create all the shading network in this context. So I'm bringing the albedo. Actually, let's make sure we got the 8K version, and let's plug that into the diffuse. So I'm setting the color space to linear. We're gonna use some ACs workflow, so let's make sure it's utility sRGB texture and output is ACs. All right, so let's rename that albedo and let's render. So I didn't apply the material. I'm gonna rename that mossy rock, and let's get rid of this one. Okay, so let's apply this material onto our geometry. Should update in a sec. Here we go. And yeah, let's see. First, let's disable display sRGB. We want to use OCIO, and in OCIO, let's make sure we are using the ACs workflow. So you have more information into my previous tutorial about ACs. We won't talk too much about it in this tutorial. Okay, so in here, let's also make sure that the color mapping is set to color mapping, no gamma. And let's set that into ACCG. Let's actually refresh the IPR. Sometimes it doesn't update properly by itself. All right, that seems all right. We got a couple of lights. I'm actually gonna disable this one and enable the sunset. So it's all HDRI you can find on HDRI Heaven. So we should be ready to start shading properly now. I'm gonna copy this image and we're gonna work on the normal. So let's call that normal, and I'm gonna import the proper texture, this one. And to connect it, we need to create a Vray bump. And let's actually plug this image into the bump texture color. So creating a dot using Alt-click on the connection. So in here, we don't need any color space conversion, so let's disable that. So normal is a data and doesn't need any color space information. So we just need to turn the type into normal tangent, and if we change the bump amount, we can affect the result with this normal. So it's a nice way to fake some kind of bump. I'm gonna keep it pretty low. In that case, I'd rather use some displacement. And well, the displacement is gonna tessellate the geometry and push the vertices. So it's a legit way to create some irregularities on the mesh. So let's convert that into a float and plug the displacement into surface of the Vray output. Okay. So from there, we're gonna need to set up the displacement and probably relaunch the IPR. So Megascan displacement is a basic grayscale, so we need to center the values ourselves. So I usually like to use this expression. That should help centering the values. And so let's bring the EXR. It's like you would assume, because it's an EXR, that all the values are right from the beginning, but actually it's not the case. So if we check out the values in Nuke, we actually see that it's actually very bright, and if we offset by minus 0.5, that should supposed to like center the values, but it's still not the case. Probably we should even go lower than that. Yeah, I'm trying to find out if there is any negative values, but well, there isn't. So that's one thing to consider with the Megascan textures, is that the displacement isn't always centered. So let's set the subdivisions for displace. I think 7 subdivs should be enough. And let's try it. Oof, so the default values is a bit too much. We should just decrease the amount. It's looking much better already. That's probably way too much, but 0.05, yeah, that looks better. I usually prefer exporting the displacement from ZBrush myself, so I know that it's gonna be exported properly in full float. So maybe at some point I'll do a ZBrush tutorial about it, and in the meantime we'll just use whatever Megascan gave us. So we're gonna move on to the roughness. In Vray it's actually not roughness that we are using, but glossiness. So we're gonna do some adjustment to convert that into a proper glossiness. So the difference is that roughness is the invert of the glossiness. So what we need to do, let's do a Vray OCIO. So I'm just gonna visualize the roughness and convert it into a diffuse for now, just to be able to visualize it properly into ACs. And I'm gonna plug the color and convert it into a float, and let's plug this float into reflect glossiness. So we're gonna need to increase the reflection, and basically the lower is the glossiness, the more blurry it's gonna be. We'll also have metalness control, etc. Well, we have no metal, so this is pretty useless in this case. All right, okay, let's check out how it looks. All right, so we haven't done any changes to this roughness yet. And originally it's looking very bright, which means it's very diffuse. So let's invert this texture to convert that into a proper glossiness. So that would be the representation of the glossiness. And it's looking pretty dark, which means it's supposed to be pretty blurry, like probably more diffuse specular into the moss. So we could actually try that onto the reflect glossiness. Right now we are still doing operation on the diffuse. So let's do a Vray invert float, and we're gonna replug the proper diffuse. All right, so that would be the intended look for the glossiness. Now let's say I'd like to tweak that and make some wet moss. Well, we could use a Vray remap and remap the values of our original texture. So let's use a Vray remap, and okay, let's make sure we are using an input value and exporting a color. So I'm gonna plug that back into the diffuse for now, just to visualize what's going on. And let's also convert that into a float, and we'll plug that into the reflection glossiness to see how it affects both the diffuse and the changes on the glossiness. All right, so first we need to reverse the values. To reverse that, we could actually change output min and output max. That way we are having the exact same effect of the Vray invert float. And as soon as we move the color ramp, we can basically remap those values. So we are contrasting this texture a lot more. So the moss is darker than the rock, which means it's more diffuse. In that case, for a wet moss, we'd like the opposite. We'd like it to be brighter so that it's actually more shiny and clear reflection. So something more like that, I guess. Yeah, so having the moss in white would make the reflection sharper and look it more wet, and the dark would make it more diffuse. So probably too diffuse, so I'm putting some kind of gray value. And I don't want something completely white either for the moss, otherwise, well, kind of want something a tiny bit blurry, but not too much. Something that looks still pretty clear. Okay, so gonna reconnect the diffuse so we see what's going on. And we start to see some interesting specular going on into the moss. We should probably re-enable the displacement to make it look more obvious. But we definitely can see how much sharper it's looking. Okay, let's replug the displace. Yeah, it's helping a bit to see what's going on with this specular. And yeah, maybe we're gonna adjust a bit the values. So I'm probably gonna set that a bit darker, like something more diffuse for the rock. Yeah, slightly more diffuse into the rock area. And we could probably diffuse more the moss as well. Actually, I'm going to do something more drastic. Yeah, I think the changes is a bit more obvious now. Okay. So from here, I'm going to adjust a bit the displacement, maybe something higher. And let's try with an overlighting too. It's always good to swap a bit the lights. Oh, that's too intense, I guess. All right, well, it's not looking too bad. I actually prefer having some more contrast into the roughness, making things a bit more interesting in my opinion. But yeah, well, depends what look you want to achieve really. So a little trick to make the diffuse a bit more interesting sometimes, it's to use a Vray which generates an occlusion. It's a bit more expensive in terms of rendering time though, so be aware that it can significantly increase your rendering times. So I'm gonna color correct the albedo, and let's set that to advanced, and we're gonna decrease the brightness. So we wanna mix a version of the albedo that's like way darker, something like that maybe. So we're gonna use the occlusion to mix the original albedo with this color corrected albedo. And basically you want the darkest one replacing the shadow. Yeah, something like that. I'm gonna actually save a picture, and let's decrease the brightness. So something like 0.2. All right, let's save that. I'm gonna compare. Yeah, it's bringing some interesting shadow into the texture, so that's pretty interesting. So you could do that in comp, of course, or you could also bake it straight into your texture. That would be more cost efficient. Then that's pretty much it for today, guys. Thank you for watching. It was a very quick introduction to shading with Vray. I hope it was useful, and if it was, I'll do more of this in the future. In the meantime, take care, and I'll see you guys next time.